right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. As is my custom for these lectures, I want to, first of all, thank you all for coming and welcome you to the first in this year's series of Dumanian Lectures in the area of Armenian studies. These are brought to you by, so to speak, the generosity of the Dumanian family, and particularly of Mrs. Edma Dumanian, to whom we are quite grateful for her ongoing support, and also by the newly named Department of Middle Eastern Studies. It takes me a little bit to get used to that. But we are very pleased to be able to bring this series on Armenian studies to you again this year. And as ever, I am going to ask Professor Ripsime Harutunian, who is really the heart and soul of our Armenian studies program, to do the introductions for our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Holly, and good evening, everyone. I'm happy to see all of you here. You are heroes because, of the weather. I know that it was hard to leave the house, but very much thank you that you are here. So we are actually happy today that we can host Bogdan Pavlish, who is a historian of early modern Eastern Europe, whose research focuses mostly on the Armenians of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He studied social sciences and history in Kiev and Budapest. He earned his PhD in history from Northwestern University here at Chicago in 2024. His dissertation was entitled, "Nothing is Exotic But Ourselves, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Armenian Diaspora of Poland-Lithuania in the 17th Century." That examines the role of the Armenian communities of Lviv and other towns of present-day Ukraine in cultural, commercial, and diplomatic exchanges between Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Bogdan is currently working on his first book project, which explores themes of distance, difference, and translation at the intersection of the early Armenian diaspora, Catholic missionization, and multicultural societies of Eastern Europe in the 17th century. His research draws on primary sources in several languages from archives and libraries in Ukraine, Poland, Italy, and Armenia. His writings have appeared in the Journal of the Early Modern History and Ab Imperio. So everyone, let's welcome our today's speaker, Bogdan Pavlish.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Harutunian, for the introduction, and Professor Schisler for welcoming me here. Also want to thank Salma, Sarah, and Matt for the logistical support of my lecture. It's a great honor to present in this series and in this department. So I'm a little nervous. I'm not an Orientalist, I'm not an Ottomanist, but I think I have something interesting for you to say from my research in Ukrainian and Polish archives about the relations between Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And so I want to start this lecture from the place called Lviv, or also known as Lwów in Polish, Ilov in Armenian, Lemberg in German. And here you can see the beautiful panoramic view of the city from early 17th century. And it's called Leopolis, which was its Latin name. So the caption to this image reads, Leopolis, capital of South Ruthenia, the most famous trading center of Eastern goods. Emporium Mercium Orientalium Celeberimum. It is precisely the commercial significance of the city as an emporium, a major trading center between Eastern Europe and the Middle East, that provides the essential background to my talk tonight. From the late Middle Ages onward, so-called Oriental trade made Lviv a meeting ground for people and objects from all over Western Eurasia. Merchants from the Crimea, Balkans, Anatolia, Armenia, Syria, and Persia came here to sell textiles, leather, and spices, buying instead local luxuries such as amber and furs. Some of the earliest and most numerous of these newcomers were Armenians who started settling in Lviv by the 14th century and established here a thriving diasporic community, active long-distance trade, crafts, and cross-cultural mediation. Several Armenian colonies emerged in major towns on the trading routes between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and here you can see on the map sort of major points where Armenians settled, especially Kaffa, Kamieniec, and Lvov. You can see, it's in Polish, I'm sorry, it's Lvov is our place where we are tonight. And so they kind of stretched from the Crimea through Moldavia to Western Ukraine, not going so much into present-day Poland for some reason, but I will explain why. And so the Kaffa, the Genoese colony of Kaffa, was sort of the source of this movement of Armenians into Eastern Europe, and Lviv was its endpoint, where they found particularly favorable conditions to practice trade and make use of their extensive diasporic connections and cross-cultural skills. In many respects, Armenians were responsible for turning the city into the keynote of commercial and diplomatic contacts between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths and the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period. So my talk tonight will explicate this connection between the Armenians of Lviv and the Commonwealth's relations with its southeastern neighbors in 4 steps. So first, I will briefly describe the institutional structure of long-distance trade and commercial mediation in Lviv, focusing on the Office of City Interpreter, or Tłumacz Miejski in Polish, a public office responsible for translation and brokerage between foreign and local merchants. Second, I will introduce the Armenian community of Lviv and one of its members, Mikołaj Bajdulowicz, one of the best documented city interpreters who stayed in office for almost 25 years in the second half of the 17th century. He will be our guide through the rest of the talk. In the third part, I will follow Bajdulowicz on his mission to Edirne as an interpreter of the big Polish embassy to the Ottoman court. I will reflect on larger trends in diplomatic translation and linguistic scholarship in the Commonwealth at the time. And finally, in the fourth part of the talk, I will return to Bajdulowicz's primary job as city interpreter in Lviv, highlighting sort of the predicament of interpreters, of his social and professional standing at the intersection of commercial and diplomatic mediation at the time when the relations between Poland-Lithuania and the Ottoman Empire was really deteriorating for unprecedented scale. So to the first part. So Lviv was the only city in the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that had its own public interpreter. This office was most likely the byproduct of the city's extensive monopoly on trade with the North Black Sea region and the Middle East. The city assumed great commercial significance in the late Middle Ages due to its location along major trading routes connecting Hanseatic ports on the Baltic Sea and the Venetian and Genoese colonies on the Black Sea. As you can see on this map, Lviv sits right in the middle of the watershed between the two major river systems in Eastern Europe, that of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. From the mid-14th century, when the city and the surrounding region of Ruthenia was incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland, the city received several royal privileges that granted it monopoly on all trade with the East. One of the most important privileges was called the staple right, or jus depositionis in Latin, and it obliged all merchants coming from the southeast to stop in the city and put their merchandise on sale for 14 days. And only citizens of the city were allowed to trade with the visiting merchants. Many cities in medieval Europe had similar arrangement for specific types of goods, often for a limited period of time. But Lviv was one of the few cities in the Kingdom of Poland that enjoyed the universal and perpetual right. And in 1444, this privilege was further expanded to include important prohibition for foreign merchants to go anywhere else in Poland but Lviv. So they all had to stop there and trade there. This effectively turned the city into the Emporium of Eastern trade, as it is known in Polish and Ukrainian historiography, and local merchants were the first to buy highly priced imports from the east and then sell them to the rest of the kingdom. In the second half of the 15th century, the Ottoman expansion into the North Black Sea region disrupted long-distance trade for a while, especially the North Black Sea connection to Poland-Lithuania, so Kaffa lost its importance. But many Polish historians today argue that the Ottoman conquests and commercial centralization in Southeast Europe just changed the direction of the trade. So now Istanbul and Ankara became the major sort of trading partners of Lviv during the Ottoman period. And now you can see on this map the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealths. So it's not still Commonwealths because it's 1519, so it's like still 50 years until they merge, but you can see that it's marked by yellow, the borders. They were already in the sort of dynastic union, so those were like one country, but you can see the red line, and Lemberg is like in the middle, like right in the southeast corner of the Polish part, because it doesn't make sense to consider it as a sort of southeastern gateway into the Commonwealth as such, but when you look at it from the sort of Polish perspective, it's right in this corner where it touches on Moldavia and then goes into Wallachia and the rest of the Ottoman Empire. So the centrality of Eastern trade for Lviv's economy helps illuminate some aspects of the office of city interpreter. First references to individual interpreters appeared in the oldest surviving books of records in the 1380s. Several people, predominantly Armenians, were called tolmac in different phonetic variations, tłumac, or sometimes interpres in Latin. Since they were mentioned only as private individuals, it is not really clear if there was an actual office of interpreter at the time. What can be inferred from the predominance of Armenians among the first interpreters is that they specialized in Eastern languages, most likely Kipchak, also known as Kuman or Tatar, the lingua franca of the Golden Horde, and also the language spoken by Armenians in the Crimea and wider Eastern Europe. Individual Armenian interpreters kept appearing in the city records throughout the 15th century. In 1441, King Władysław III granted Lviv a special privilege to elect its own interpreters, confirming the custom upheld by the city since the ancient times. The royal decree didn't provide any details of interpreters' duties or linguistic specialization, but it did suggest that they must have been employed by the city for some time. The right of the city council to elect and appoint interpreters was confirmed by King Sigismund I a century later in 1542. This time the royal decree used a panoply of terms to refer to interpreters, calling them interpres, proxoneta, licitadores, as well as tłumac, matlesh. Matlesh is like a German version of the word. These terms clearly indicated that interpreters were primarily involved in commercial brokerage between foreign and local merchants. Functions of translation and brokerage were so closely intertwined that they were rarely treated separately. In a local legal treatise from the mid-17th century, the office of interpreter was claimed to be derived from the Greek notion of proxoneta, or German Mäklisch, whose meaning was defined as, I quote, someone who translates a foreign language and prevents any fraud or deceit in transactions, end of quote. Similar identification of linguistic and commercial mediation with the emphasis on the latter was typical for contemporary Venice, the biggest European hub of trade with the Ottoman Empire. As Natalie Rothman has shown, Venice's diverse body of brokers was composed of trans-imperial subjects such as redeemed slaves, Catholic converts, and Eastern Christians from the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Persia. Their mediating activity hinged on their knowledge of languages, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and even some Slavic languages. It seems, however, that linguistic expertise did not play such an important role in legal definition of brokerage in early modern Europe in general. For example, Benvenuto Straccas, he was a famous Italian lawyer who wrote a influential legal treatise on brokerage never mentions any kind of translation involved in this, in the mediation between merchants. It didn't really engage with international trade at all. It was rather the commercial practice of cities in direct trade with the Ottoman Empire, like Venice, Dubrovnik, or Lviv, that rendered linguistic mediation an integral part of brokerage. Another distinguishing feature of Lviv's interpreters was their counterintelligence activity, to put it in modern language. As public officials, they were responsible for keeping track of all foreign merchants and other newcomers in the city. By the same token, interpreters had to make sure that no spies infiltrated the Commonwealth from the southeast. Again, this part of their authority was legally and ideologically associated with the status of the city as the Emporium of Eastern trade in the Commonwealth. In the middle of the 17th century, one of the key justifications for reinforcing the city's declining staple right was precisely the need for effective counterintelligence amid rising tensions with the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. The above-mentioned legal treatise traced the origins of this institution back to the Roman Empire, where trade with Persia was restricted to 3 cities in the east to prevent foreigners from going into the interior and potentially learning state secrets, Arcana Imperii, as it's known in Latin. Curiously enough, the geography of the Roman Emporia, those trade centers in the east, especially the city of Artasata, overlapped with the Armenian homeland. But the author of this treatise, who was just a Polish lawyer in the mid-17th century, didn't really make any sort of connections with the Armenians serving here as interpreters and Armenia being in the Roman Empire as one of the sort of outposts in the east. Finally, interpreters in the 17th century, at least, were charged with the interesting duty of providing carpets and other elegant textiles for the decoration of the city hall and the Catholic cathedral on major holidays. This peculiar responsibility was most likely premised on the assumption that interpreters closely interacted with all foreign merchants in the city and could theoretically find and purchase the best decorations available on the market. Quite ironically, there was no explicit mention of translation, the most important and specialized of the interpreter's functions. It was sort of subsumed under the requirement for the interpreter and his assistants to speak foreign languages. They usually referred as języki cudzoziemskie, or like foreign languages, which were unspecified but understood to include Eastern languages like Turkish, Tatar, Armenian, Greek, and ideally Persian. In other contemporary documents, they were also referred to as Eastern, Oriental, or even exotic. Now, going to the Armenian component of this story. As I already mentioned, Armenian names dominated the list of interpreters in the late Middle Ages, and this tendency continued into the early modern period, all the way through the sort of last decades of the office's existence in the 18th century. So why were Armenians so often recruited as interpreters? There are several reasons for this, and they are all interconnected. First of all, Armenians had their permanent presence in Lviv. As an autonomous ethno-religious community, they started settling in the city from the time of its foundation in the mid-13th century. A century later, they were granted a number of economic and legal privileges that gave them extensive rights of self-government, including a council of elders and civil justice courts. These institutions were regulated by a separate law code based on the legal tradition of medieval Armenia. Lviv was also the seat of the Armenian Archbishop for all Eastern Europe, including Armenians in Moldavia and Wallachia. This elaborate infrastructure made the Armenian community an integral and increasingly familiar part of the local society. The second point is that Armenians were particularly active in long-distance trade with the Middle East. The famous Armenian traveler of the early 17th century, Simeon Lechatsi, even claimed that, I quote, "Among the Armenians of Lviv there are no artisans. They are all great and wealthy merchants. They have agents in Istanbul, Angora, Isfahan, Moscow, Gdansk, and other places. Among them are Hojas who have 50, 60, 80, or 100,000 kurush or more." Simeon was obviously exaggerating, especially about the absence of Armenian artisans, but his inaccuracy was very indicative of the social and economic power wielded by big merchants in the Armenian community of Lviv. The same travel account illustrates another important aspect of Armenian involvement in long-distance trade, namely the spread of the communities along major trade routes from Poland-Lithuania to the Ottoman Empire through Moldavia and Wallachia. So Simeon's own journey to Istanbul took him to places like Suceava, Iași, and Berlat in Moldavia, Provadia in Rumelia, where he found many Armenian households, churches, and clergy. And this greatly facilitated travel between Lviv and Istanbul and other places in Anatolia for Armenian merchants and pilgrims like Simeon himself. The third and final reason for the prevalence of Armenians in the ranks of Lviv's interpreters was their knowledge of relevant languages. So they spoke primarily Kipchak language as their everyday language and used it in public affairs. So it was mixed with Slavic words and always written in Armenian script. So it was now it's called Armeno-Kipchak, and that allowed them to sort of translate for Turkic languages at least. In the second half of the 17th century, Polish replaced Kipchak as the language of record keeping for Armenian communities in Lviv. Only educated elites, clergy, maybe some recent newcomers from Armenia proper would speak Middle Armenian or Classical Armenian. So having established these broad contexts of long-distance trade and the Armenian diaspora in Poland-Lithuania, I now want to zoom in on the figure of Mikołaj Bajdułowicz, an Armenian interpreter who was active in Lviv in the second half of the 17th century. His career spanned almost 3 decades and a number of different mediating roles, which he performed on behalf of his Armenian community, the city council of Lviv, which was predominantly Catholic, and the royal court in Warsaw. His 1667 contract with the city council, which we just discussed the duties, it's considered the most comprehensive account of interpreters, authorities, and duties that we know. He is also the best documented interpreter because he constantly litigated with his uneasy collaborators / contenders, also Armenian interpreters in Lviv. So detailed records of these lawsuits from the National Archives in Lviv and some important references to them in the Royal Archives in Warsaw allowed me to reconstruct his eventful life and professional trajectory. In the remaining of this talk, I want to use his career as a window on the social and cultural dimensions of commercial and diplomatic translation in the Commonwealth. So who was Mikołaj Bajdułowicz? Like many other of his contemporaries serving as interpreters, he was a recent newcomer to the Armenian community in Lviv. He was originally from Suceava, the capital of the Moldavian Principality, one of the Ottoman vassal states in Southeast Europe. For the first time, Bajdułowicz appeared in Lviv's public records in December 1635 when he was admitted to citizenship in what seemed like a relatively young age because we encounter him much later in the 1690s in the records. The person who recommended him to the city council for citizenship was Armenian Mikołaj Warteresowicz, a son of the wealthiest citizen of Lviv, Armenian Jan Warteresowicz. It is hard to establish the exact nature of Bajdułowicz's relationship with the Warteresowicz family. He might have been one of their factors representing their interests across the Middle East. They had their agents all the way in Isfahan and Diyarbakir. But his endorsement, what is most probable, however, is that Bajdułowicz started practicing brokerage as an assistant of Mikołaj Warteresowicz, who was city interpreter in the mid-1630s. And in order to be hired by the interpreter as his assistant, he had to have citizenship of the city. So over the next decade and a half, Warteresowicz and other Armenian brokers faced fierce competition from the influential Greek merchant based in Lviv, Jan Afendik, who was appointed as the city interpreter for few terms in the 1640s. In the early 1650s, Bajdułowicz emerged as a messenger of the Armenian community of Lviv to Catholicos Pilipos of Echmiadzin, who at the time stayed in Istanbul. His mission was part of the prolonged negotiations between the Armenian elders, Archbishop of Lviv, and Catholicos. Catholicos is the head of the Armenian Church. So there were like a very complicated negotiations between the different parts of the Armenian diaspora about the church union between the Armenians in Poland-Lithuania and the Catholic Church in Rome. And so Bajdolovich was one of the messengers who was on the mission to Catholicos to negotiate the acceptable conditions for the union. It is not clear how much agency he had in the delicate business of ecclesiastical negotiations, probably not much. And yet he must have commanded a great deal of trust from the Armenian elders to be sent on such an important mission. It was most likely his knowledge of languages, at least Turkish and Armenian, and experience of traveling to the Ottoman Empire that qualified him for this assignment. 4 years later, in February 1658, he was appointed the city interpreter of Lviv. His first 3-year tenure was marked by attempts to consolidate commercial brokerage in the hands of the city interpreter and his assistants. It was a sign of that the city's foreign trade was in decline after the severe political crisis of the mid-century, but it also revealed a dispersed and often situational nature of translation. Since Lviv hosted several diasporic minorities with connections with the Ottoman Empire, besides Armenians, there were also Jews and Greeks. There was no shortage of people who could help foreign merchants circumvent procedures and avoid fees enforced by the interpreter. So while Armenians were overwhelmingly represented in the interpreter's ranks throughout the 4 centuries of the office's existence, they were rivaled by Greeks and Jews in the 17th century. The Greek diaspora was the smallest of all minorities, but it was disproportionately represented by wealthy merchants from both Venetian and Ottoman parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Major contenders of Armenians, Greeks, held the office of interpreter for multiple consecutive terms in the 1640s and then in the 1680s and 90s. So in his first tenure, Bajdolovich was focused on mostly preventing Jews from practicing illegal brokerage outside their legal domain, because they were allowed to be brokers and interpreters only for other Jewish merchants from the Commonwealth at specific fairs held like temporarily in different places in the country. They were not allowed to mediate between Jews from the Ottoman Empire, for example, coming to the Commonwealth. The cases that Bajdolovich brought to court against Jewish brokers involved Armenian merchants from Ankara. There were like 2 cases with Armenians from Ankara who had to eventually pay some fine for employing local Jewish brokers. In early 1660, several months into the 3rd and final year of his first tenure, Bajdolovich decided to abandon his contract very, very suddenly. Already in May, he made sudden arrangements with the city council and the royal court to renounce his position in favor of Tomasz Abrahamovich, another Armenian originally from Zamość in Poland. So in July, he officially gave up the office of interpreter and ended his contract. After this entry, Bajdolovich disappeared from the city records for the next 6 years. His sudden renouncement of the office must have been prompted by something truly urgent and irresistible. So Bajdolovich claimed to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which was indeed a serious commitment involving a special oath known as Ucht in Armenian, without disregarding the spiritual motive behind this spontaneous decision. There might be another more compelling reason for him to go to the Holy Land. So on May 24th of the same year, 1660, King Jan Kazimierz sent an interesting letter to the city council of Lviv, ordering appointment of whomever Bajdolovich would recommend as his substitute for the period of his absence, which was mentioned exactly as around 4 years. So after his return, he was supposed to be reappointed. It would be quite unusual for a king to take such a strong interest in personal affairs of a simple pilgrim. The most intriguing part of the letter, however, dealt with the possible purpose of Bajdołowicz's rash departure. He was said to go, and I quote, to the foreign lands in certain services of ours, having taken on himself the duty of pilgrimage. So he was probably performing some private mission for the king. which wasn't really specified in any other sources that I looked through. So there was this strange secrecy about his mission, because all other sources, especially in the Royal Chancellery in Warsaw, mentioned that he was going on the pilgrimage. They would issue him a letter of passage to the Ottoman Empire and mention that this is for his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So I argue that it was this persistent emphasis on the religious nature of his journey that betrayed its likely political motives, suggested also by King's letter and his unusual strong endorsement of Wojtyłowicz's claim to the office of interpreter. This does not necessarily mean that he didn't make the pilgrimage or didn't take it seriously, especially at the time when Armenians from different parts of the world started coming to Jerusalem in an increasingly organized manner and in large numbers. But his sort of secret royal service, I think, provides a much more compelling explanation, not only for his sudden disappearance, but also for his extravagant return almost 6 years later. So in late 1666, Wojtyłowicz came back to Lviv and was able to win back the office of interpreter from his colleague Abrahamowicz by paying the city council 1,200 zlotys, which was an exorbitant sum for the office. Usually they would pay around 300, 400 zlotys for the 3 years. So they were like renting out the right to practice brokerage and translation. He paid 1,200 zlotys, which is like enormous sum. He was, we know that he was kind of supported in this by another Armenian broker and interpreter, Kirkor Babovich, who was an Armenian from Isfahan. He recently moved to Lviv, to Poland-Lithuania, and settled there and started practicing brokerage. But Wojtyłowicz must have also had a significant sum of money to pay for this rent. However, he didn't get to stay in Lviv much longer. In several months, in spring 1667, he was attached as an interpreter to the big embassy of royal envoy Hieronym Radziejowski to the Ottoman court in Edirne. Unlike many other European countries, the Commonwealth didn't have its resident ambassador in Istanbul, so the court had to dispatch a new embassy every time there was a need for diplomatic contacts on the highest level. The 1667 embassy was organized by King Jan Kazimierz due to the rising tensions between the Ottoman Empire and the Commonwealth because of the recent peaceful agreement between the Commonwealth and Muscovy at Andrusovo in 1667. So the Ottoman court was afraid of the alliance between Muscovy and the Commonwealth, and they sort of started signaling that they wanted to start a war against the Commonwealth. That's why the king sent the embassy to Edirne to negotiate a sort of peace agreement in anticipation of this possible military campaign. So Wojtyłowicz's participation in this embassy was requested by some of the most influential people in Commonwealth's foreign policy, namely by Envoy Radziejowski and Crown Hetman Jan Sobieski, the future king of the Commonwealth, who, as you all probably know, defeated the Ottomans at Vienna in 1683. Sobieski characterized Wojtyłowicz as, I quote, versed in different languages and well acquainted with those lands and customs of the Ottoman port. Not a very detailed characteristic, but quite flattering. So the participation in this important embassy attested to Wojtyłowicz's credentials, but it also exposed inadvertently the limitations of his expertise. So there is little direct evidence of his performance in the Ottoman Empire. He was hardly mentioned in the official account of the embassy, composed by the envoy's secretary Franciszek Wysocki. In this account, interpreters of the embassy were referred mostly collectively and as couriers and fixers on the long journey through the Balkans to Edirne. So on arriving in Edirne, where the Sultan Mehmed IV stayed with his court at the time, Envoy Radziejowski relied on famous Habsburg interpreter Marcantonio Mamucca della Torre. So he assisted the ambassador in all in-person interactions with the Ottoman authorities. 2 Polish interpreters were once mentioned to accompany the Commonwealth delegation to some Ottoman dignitaries, again, along with Dragoman Mamuka de la Torre. Apparently, Bajdović and other interpreters attached to the embassy did not qualify to mediate in these important political negotiations, or my suggestion is they were simply distrusted by the envoy. And this suggestion, in fact, has a sort of an earlier confirmation in an accident that happened in 1640 when another Polish-Armenian interpreter, Jan Romaszkiewicz, was so frightened of the Ottoman vizier and Sultan Ibrahim I that he repeatedly mistranslated what Polish envoy Wojciech Miaskowski expected him to communicate to them. So that was a sort of a big scandal after the embassy. And Bajdović shared Romaszkiewicz's predicament as an Armenian interpreter of humble origins, serving in a big embassy led by high-ranking nobles. Despite the impressive record of diplomatic missions and public service, they both seemed to lack the necessary trust of their envoys. So Envoy Miaskowski in 1640 explicitly blamed Romaszkiewicz's poor performance on his lowly descent. So he kind of associated it with the timidity of his personality. It's probably rooted in this whole exaggerated Polish noble ideology. So there was this kind of sharp distinction between nobles and non-nobles, and the envoy was blaming everything on his interpreter's low social origins. Quite surprisingly, the envoy didn't question Romaszkiewicz's linguistic skills, although he couldn't really assess this side of the performance. It still didn't raise any of his suspicions. Similarly, Bajdović might have been removed from direct diplomatic negotiations in Edirne due to his social background rather than his deficient knowledge of languages. In contrast to Romaszkiewicz, however, he was definitely less versed in a diplomatic register of Ottoman Turkish, with all the concomitant intricacies of the Ottoman court ceremonial, since it was his first big embassy. Another much more obvious limitation of Bajdović's expertise was his ignorance of written Ottoman Turkish. The report of Radziowski's embassy explicitly mentions that none of the attached interpreters could read or write Ottoman Turkish, so Habsburg Dragoman was the only one who could make sure that the final version of the treaty, drafted by the Sultan's officials, did not diverge from the negotiated agreement. Such deficiency was certainly lamentable, but not unusual in the 17th century, especially in this mid-century crisis for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Radziowski's secretary Wysocki, who wrote the report of the embassy, explained rather casually that, I quote, "There are no such people in Poland except the person kept at the royal court who could read and write in Ottoman Turkish," end of quote. Indeed, most contemporary interpreters, whether Armenian or not, did not have any comment of the complicated language of the Ottoman bureaucracy, which combined elements of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. The lack of interpreters proficient in Ottoman Turkish persisted throughout the second half of the 17th century. The next big embassy to the Ottoman Empire, led by Jan Gniński in 1677 and 1678, suffered from this problem to a much greater extent. So Gniński's diary is peppered with ridiculous stories of him and his assistants being presented with important documents, including treaty drafts, which they did not understand whatsoever because none of their interpreters could read Ottoman Turkish, and they had no attached dragoman to the embassy. By the same token, they could not promptly respond with their own corrections and suggestions, which had to be put in a proper written form. Although Latin was still widely used in diplomacy, this didn't help the two sides agree even on the recently concluded peace treaty, just like a year ago, which served as a framework for the negotiations, because the Ottomans claimed to be bound only by the Turkish version, and Poles claimed to be bound by the Latin version, and apparently they differed quite a lot. So losing momentum in highly sensitive negotiations, Gniński repeatedly sent Latin documents for Turkish translation to the French embassy and Franciscan monastery in Galata. Quite understandably, he complained that the Poles were, I quote, were almost going crazy because of this deficiency of proper dragomans, despite the fact that some distinguished Armenian interpreters, such as Bogdan Seferovich-Spiendowski and Zachariasz Piotrowicz, who are quite famous in Polish-Ottoman relations, they were attached to the embassy, but they couldn't help read the documents. So, in this regard, Bajdulowicz was typical of the wider milieu of Armenian interpreters in the diplomatic service of the Commonwealth in the 17th century. His limited proficiency in Eastern languages, primarily Ottoman Turkish, was a tolerated norm rather than a deplorable defect. It also reflected a broader trend in the Commonwealth's perception and knowledge of the Ottoman Empire and its many cultures. As Polish historian Jan Reichman observed, the second half of the 17th century witnessed a paradoxical situation when the nobility and townspeople were very fascinated by the Ottoman culture, especially material culture, but at the same time they didn't have the expertise and language training to to study and to understand this culture more deeply beyond the just surfaces of the clothes that they all proudly wore as sort of Sarmatians that they claimed to be. As envoy Miaskowski pointed out in 1640, only several decades earlier, there was actually a whole constellation of native translators recruited from the nobility and trade in the Ottoman Empire at the Commonwealth's cost. So people like Krzysztof Dzierżek, Samuel Otwinowski, active in the late 16th, early 17th century, they were proficient in Ottoman Turkish, they interpreted for the embassies, and they also translated official documents and even literary texts. Despite the remarkable results, this initial attempt at systematic training of translators did not turn into a consistent policy. And there is a kind of very indicative episode with famous French Orientalist Franciscus Mezinian Meninsky, who was serving at the time in the 1650s at the royal court in Warsaw. And he was contemplating an idea of a school for translators in Warsaw, where he was that would provide training for translators in all major Eastern languages on the site in the Commonwealth before sending them to the Ottoman Empire. So it was quite a interesting sort of more academic approach to the language scholarship than that it used to be practiced at the time, because it was mostly like apprenticeship based on the Venetian model, so well described by Natalie Rothman. But the Commonwealth was going through one of the most difficult periods in its history in the mid-17th century, with a lot of internal strife and repeated foreign invasions. So it was simply the wrong time for such a project. And eventually Meninsky left the Commonwealth and moved to Vienna, to the Habsburg court, where he made a spectacular diplomatic and academic career as one of the most distinguished Orientalists of his time. The Commonwealth's own School of Oriental Languages was established in Istanbul only 100 years later, in 1766, along with the first permanent embassy. But it was way too late for the Commonwealth because it was partitioned in only 20, 30 years. So up until then, the royal court continued recruiting translators rather haphazardly, often employing former captives in the Ottoman Empire who had necessary language skills. So one of such translators, recently ransomed from the captivity in the Ottoman Empire, was appointed in June 1667, exactly when Bajdulowicz was in Edirne on this embassy with Envoy Radziejowski. And this translator's name was Kazimierz Zajerski. He was, oh, sorry, I missed this part. No, okay. So he was, Zajerski was proficient in Ottoman Turkish and was made responsible for translating diplomatic correspondence between the Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire. Unlike many of his predecessors who received training by going to the Ottoman Empire with embassies, his language school was his long captivity in the Middle East, in Arabia and Egypt, He probably spent there around 15 years. He was captured during one of the big battles between the Crimean Khanate and the Commonwealth in the early 1650s. And then he ended up in Arabia and later in Egypt. And he was redeemed and employed as a translator by the royal court. So he was jealously guarded by the king. He kept him at his side all the time, even when some important embassies left for Istanbul or Bakhchisarai. They would leave like without a proper dragoman. The Zayerski was always in Warsaw. And so there was like a very clear division of labor between the interpreters, and translators. But despite this sort of division, Bajdołowicz, our protagonist, soon established a very good rapport with Zayerski, and he would later mobilize royal support through translator Zayerski, rather than through other Armenian interpreters who served at the court as well. So, despite being overshadowed by Ottoman dragomans and royal translators, Armenian interpreters still had an important role to play, even in big embassies like that of Envoy Radziejowski to Edirne. So it is hard to imagine any of the embassy's interactions with the local society in the Ottoman Empire without the support and assistance of these go-betweens. Some historians suggested that Bajdołowicz spied on the embassy of the Ukrainian Cossacks, who came to Edirne around the same time to ask for an Ottoman protectorate against the Commonwealth and Muscovy. So they were like very natural allies of the Ottoman Empire against Muscovy and the Commonwealth. So if this suggestion is correct, that would mean that Bajdołowicz also spoke some old Ukrainian, which was used by the Cossacks at the time, which was also the language very common in Lviv and the surrounding areas. And this assignment, sort of gathering intelligence, would perfectly fit into his record of secret royal service in the Ottoman Empire that we talked about slightly earlier. Another important mission that he might have participated in was the ransom of captives, which was like a very standard practice in Polish diplomacy in the Ottoman Empire. So in mid-July 1667, the secretary of the embassy, Wysocki, left Edirne for Istanbul and to ransom several nobles, Polish nobles. Curiously enough, 2 of them were ransomed by the English ambassador and English merchants based in Istanbul. 2 others were ransomed by the Armenian Catholicos in Istanbul and Armenian merchants. So this suggests that Bajdołowicz must... So there is no like direct evidence that he went on this mission, but I sort of project that he might have been participant in this mission because he had prior contacts with the Armenian church authorities in Istanbul. So overall, the embassy was deemed a diplomatic success for the Commonwealth, but only for a brief period, as you can see in this engraving, which was made to celebrate this occasion. The Mehmed sort of threatens Jan Kazimierz with a sword, and he will sort of fulfill his promise in 5 years, invading the Commonwealth in 1672 and occupying quite a big part of the southeastern provinces. Now, going back to Lviv, so Bajdołowicz returned from the embassy in 1668, and he was recognized for his satisfactory service by generous payment from Jan Sobieski. But his service as city interpreter was about to get very turbulent. Facing increasing competition from other interpreters, Bajdołowicz had to share his office with 2 other Armenians, Tomasz Abrahamowicz that I mentioned and Kirkor Babowicz, one from Zamość in Poland, other from Persia. Although only Bajdołowicz was officially recognized as the interpreter, they 3 agreed to share all the duties, incomes, and expenses equally. In other words, the city of Lviv received 3 interpreters at once without even suspecting it. The secret contract that they signed was reinforced by their mutual promise to never sue each other or do anything without each other's consent. This agreement was brokered by and overseen by Armenian bishop Jan Keremovich, who was a bishop, actually Armenian bishop for Armenians in Moldavia and Wallachia. An interesting the reference to the Ottoman context. And he convinced the interpreters to put aside their differences and cooperate on their sort of shared ethno-religious identity. So they took a solemn oath to observe this contract on pain of excommunication and a fine of 100 zlotys. The only drawback of this agreement was that it was illegal, at least in the eyes of the city council of Lviv. As the city interpreter, Bajdolovich could hire those two others as his assistants, but their ambitions clearly exceeded whatever they could earn or achieve in this position. And so the reason this partnership became known to the authorities is that it eventually failed. In 1671, Babowicz, one of the partners, sued Bajdolovich for violating the partnership and withholding his share of profits. The resulting lawsuit not only revealed the existence of the secret partnership, but it also led the city council of Lviv to discover many instances of corruption committed by Bajdolovich in his official capacity as the city interpreter. So there was another lawsuit in late May 1671. The city council sued Bajdolovich for violating his own contract of brokerage in almost every major respect. So based on other partners' detailed testimonies and reports, the prosecution accused Bajdolovich of corruption and neglect of duty. Several witnesses confirmed those accusations. The most prominent was a Greek merchant Kyriakos from Ottoman Sinop. So he gave the most detailed testimony. So when he first arrived in Lviv, he went straight to Bajdolovich as the interpreter, which was the custom among foreigners, to introduce himself and to get permission to trade in the city. Acknowledging his ignorance of local ways, Kyriakos relied on Bajdołowich's instructions as to where to go, to whom to pay, and how much. And this is probably tempted Bajdolovich to sort of take advantage of the inexperienced foreigner. Kyriakos gave Bajdolovich some personal gifts, 5 bales of high-quality leather known as safian, which constituted one of the interpreter's fees. After some time, however, Bajdolovich required 2 more bales of leather, claiming that only 3 had been paid, so Kyriakos declined the request. Bajdolovich assaulted him verbally, swearing and threatening him to strip him of all his goods and money. A few other merchants, including Armenians from Ankara and Lviv, reported the same maltreatment at the hands of the interpreter. Finally, local Armenian elder Avedik Bernatovich confirmed that the Armenian authorities received similar complaints from other foreign merchants who lamented Bajdołowich's abuse of power so much that they, I quote, would rather go to hell than return to Lviv, end of quote. So in its final statement made on July 19, 1671, the court found Bajdolovich guilty on most charges, but the verdict didn't come into effect until the recently instigated proceeding in the royal court was concluded. So Bajdolovich, in the meantime, Bajdolovich was able to mobilize his support through translator Zajerski in Warsaw. So he started the proceeding in Warsaw, and until the proceeding was concluded in Warsaw, he couldn't be really punished here in Lviv in this case. But he was eventually removed from office and replaced by another Armenian. However, he was reappointed in 5 years in 1676, mostly because the financial and commercial difficulties caused by the Polish-Ottoman War at the time. There was not enough trade between the Ottoman Empire and the Commonwealth, so the interpreter couldn't really make much money doing this business. So another interpreter sort of declined the offer to continue in this office, and Bajdolovich took over. After 1676, his career left fewer traces in the city records. He must have learned the lesson from his previous tenure and become more cautious in his dealings with other local interpreters and foreign merchants. Bajdolovich stayed in office for at least 2 more terms and appeared before the city council in his official capacity as late as 1683. His life and professional trajectory exemplified several important aspects of commercial and diplomatic translation in a wider early modern context. So first, his multiple roles as an intermediary for different authorities showed the interconnected nature of linguistic mediation primarily in long-distance trade and diplomacy. By the same token, it attested to the critical lack of specialization among the Commonwealth's interpreters, which was especially acute in the calamitous 17th century and in the context of important embassies to the Ottoman Empire. And yet, Bajdołowicz was indeed an effective and professional intermediary recruited repeatedly by most powerful people in the Commonwealth. His career epitomized a profoundly vernacular model of linguistic mediation rooted in the Armenian community of Lviv, with its extensive diasporic connections and prominent commercial role in trade with the Middle East. Second point that I want to make is that Bajdołowicz's many lawsuits with his colleagues revealed important limitations of the ethno-religious diasporic solidarity among Armenian interpreters. Most of his rivals for the office were other Armenians, most prominently Abrahamovich and Babovich. The secret partnership that they made was indeed possible because of the intervention of the Armenian bishop, who appealed to their shared ethno-confessional identity. But even the threat of excommunication, the harshest spiritual punishment, could not save this enterprise. And it lasted only 3 years and resulted in this dramatic lawsuit in which most witnesses against Bajdołowicz were, again, Armenians, both local community leaders and foreign merchants. So the fact that all three interpreters came from three different branches of the Armenian diaspora in Poland-Lithuania, in Moldavia, and in Persia introduces another important dimension to the discussion of solidarity and trust in such dynamic diasporic communities as Armenians in Lviv and in other parts of the world as well. And my third and final point is about the ambiguous role of secrecy and invisibility in the work of interpreters. The famous notion of the translator's invisibility proposed by Loris Venuti has been influential in shaping our understanding of translation, even in historical contexts that are like far removed from late 20th century literature to which it was originally applied. And it does make a lot of sense to talk about the disappearance of the figure of translator in situations of written translation, when the correspondence between the original text and the translation should turn our attention from the translator to his work. In other words, the better the translation, the less visible the translator. But this logic does not apply, or at least does not fully apply to oral translation. And the story of the Armenian interpreters in Lviv makes it especially clear. Whether they acted as brokers on behalf of the city council or interpreters for important embassies to the Ottoman Empire, they always worked under others' gaze. The very nature of oral translation, its face-to-face setting, put the interpreters under a lot of pressure and scrutiny in the moment they were doing their job. This predicament was most prominent at the audiences with Ottoman officials, when interpreters like Bajdołowicz and especially Romoszkiewicz didn't have enough experience of court ceremonial and diplomatic etiquette to successfully serve their envoys and perform their job. As Bajdołowicz's corruption trial shown, there was still some room for secrecy and invisibility for interpreters in dealing with foreign merchants. But the eventual revelation of his offenses in court proved how closely his work was observed by other Armenian interpreters and merchants. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the floor is open for anybody who has questions or would like to ask questions. Yes?
The microphone? Sorry.
This one?
Oh.
Yeah, you'll need to move that around to whoever.
Yeah, whoever has a question, we will bring the microphone to you.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really excellent. I guess two contextual questions about Lviv at this time. Can you speak to how the origins of the Armenian community in Lviv and how they came to be native Kipchak speakers? And then more broadly, what is the linguistic situation in urban Lviv at this time in terms of both written and spoken languages?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's an important aspect of the... Should I talk into that? Okay. It's an important aspect of this whole story about city interpreters, because Armenians arrived in Lviv apparently sometime in the mid-13th century, probably from the Crimea. There is no like direct evidence where they came from, but a lot of Armenians who settled in Lviv, they had connections to the Crimea, to the Armenian communities in Kaffa, especially. There are some suggestions that they also came through Ankara and like through the Balkans in that direction. So they were like arriving from different directions, and they started settling probably mid-13th century. By the mid-14th century, and this is when we have very solid documentary evidence, they received all these privileges as they were established as a sort of legal entity, as a community, with like both legal, religious, economic privileges. And so apparently they picked up Kipchak when they moved through the Crimea and maybe through the North Black Sea region that was controlled by the Golden Horde in the late Middle Ages. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the language was sort of mixed with a lot of Slavic words, and it was written in Armenian script. Other languages spoken in Lviv around that time were German, Polish, Old Ukrainian, Ruthenian it's called, Yiddish, and maybe Hebrew for sort of religious purposes, and Latin as well. It was like a lingua franca. But there was never a need for interpreters for merchants coming from the West. So it's only applied to merchants and people coming from the Southeast. So apparently all the like major Central Western European languages were more or less, I don't know, spoken, or they just used Latin to, or maybe some version of sort of Italian to communicate among themselves. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, thank you so much. That was fascinating and a really lovely example of archival work as well. I'm curious as to why, I'm curious as to see your thoughts on why it was always the appointed interpreters were people kind of new to Lviv and like new to the area. I guess like a sub-question there would be, is it more important to have intimate knowledge and experience of the trade that you're going to be in charge of, or knowledge and connections of the people coming into the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as I understand, the newcomers were among interpreters mostly in this time, in the mid-17th century. So it's like it's quite unusual constellation of these three Armenian recent transplants from other parts of the diaspora to Lviv. But they were all more or less well integrated into the local Armenian community, because apparently the community was quite dynamic. There were always some influx of people from other parts of the diaspora, so it wasn't really such a huge deal for them to practice brokerage and to serve as interpreters. But this issue came up right after Bajdulovich was removed from office in 1672, when there was a kind of looming war with the Ottoman Empire. And the next interpreter was a very much local Armenian with like a very solid background in the community. His name was Davidovich. And his sort of pedigree was played out in his sort of appointment letter, that he was local. And I'm sort of assuming that it was a reference to the recent conflicts between all these three newcomers. So he or the authorities appointing him were trying to sort of justify his appointment through this reference to his rootedness in the local community. But it's a good question. I mean, I would need probably more information on other interpreters in other time periods to answer it more in more detail. But as far as I can tell, the newcomers, they would probably have more diverse sort of linguistic portfolio. They would speak also other languages that they learned in other parts of the Middle East. So that would be a very important advantage for them to be appointed as these officials.
Thank you very much for such a lovely presentation. Yeah, I learned so much today about Poland and, the Commonwealth especially. One thing I want to ask about those last names. So, of course, I would guess that those people, the Armenians, when they arrived to Poland, you said they would become a citizen. So that's when they would get those Abramovich, Babovich, those, last names with those endings. Did they have another name before, so they have to change? Have you traced anything about that? Like even mentioning that Kirkor came from Isfahan, right? Of course, he wouldn't have been Babovich there. So what was the situation at the time in the Commonwealth about the last names?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's also it also amuses me how these names sound strange to. Yeah, they like sound Polish and they sound strange to Armenians now because these are not like Armenian names. But Babovich is actually a very good example to explain this because he just arrived from Isfahan in the 1650s, and he came to claim a debt from one of the local Armenian merchants. It was like a very big debt, like 10,000 zlotys or something. So he came with some other Armenian merchants from Isfahan, where he was based, probably in New Julfa, like this famous, biggest Armenian diaspora. And he was immediately, in the court records, he was immediately turned into Babovich. So he was immediately referred to as Babovich, Kirkor Babovich. So that was like there was like a local practice of naming Armenians coming from these different parts of the world. So they were like always immediately translated into the sort of local idiom by giving them these names. Although not like all names would be sort of susceptible to this translation, because some names were still kept in their original sort of Turkish or Persian version. I think it mostly applied to Turkish names when they were like less easily translated into this kind of Polish Eastern European usage.
So that was the translation then. So Babovich is Bab.
Maybe Babayan, maybe he was Babayan, like in Isfahan.
So it wasn't a translation, it was more of a rendering then.
Yeah, I think it was like more rendering, yes. But this practice was very common, like in the late Middle Ages, in the early modern period. Armenians who lived in the Commonwealth, they would often use local names, like some sort of East Slavic names instead of more traditional Armenian names. And they were like referred in this like East Slavic versions of those names in the records. For example, in the 17th century, they would usually switch to more Polish Catholic names to indicate their allegiance sort of with the Polish culture, which was the most sort of prestigious culture at the time. In earlier periods, they would often use some sort of Ruthenian, Ukrainian names, for example. That was also like an interesting stage in their assimilation to the local cultures. So there were like different layers of cultures that they could sort of side with, and there was like it would indicate their sort of social aspirations and their maybe political aspirations as well. Yes.
I think I want to ask a couple of questions that are kind of interrelated in my mind. Your figure, whose name I'm not going to attempt, was seen to be in fierce competition with, in particular, a Greek candidate for the office of city broker and interpreter, right? And then later on, when he's in this partnership with the other two men in that triadic group, they all represent, that group represents a sort of line of trade that goes from Iran through Wallachia, Moldavia up to Lvov. Whereas I'm going to guess that the Greek candidate is connected more southerly through the Balkans. And I guess I'm since quite often it appears that the Armenian candidates predominate in the position, I'm curious to think about what that actually says about what the more important lines of trade were. So that's one. And the other thing I wanted to think about is what in this period exactly do we mean by corruption, right? In other words, people pay for office, that's the standard practice, and it is also, I assume, the standard practice that they make their money back by extracting profit from the people they serve, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
how public office works. So for it to be labeled at some moment in time corruption seems to me to be fundamentally more political than about honesty, in a sense, right? That he's being attacked by his enemies, not, I mean, do we really know he's doing something that's outside the usual and customary? Or just that a bunch of people who are his competitors or who dislike him in some way,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah, these are two great questions. Maybe I'll start with the corruption because I have more to say about this. Yeah, that was like probably a little bit of like anachronistic way to label this, although it was the sense that I got from these trial records is that how it was supposed to be portrayed by the city authorities. And it's kind of interesting that the city authorities started their own investigation into Bajdovic, so it wasn't part of it was instigated by testimonies and reports of his partners. And in this sense, it might be just a political sort of revenge on him from his partners who complained about him withholding their shares of profit. But there might be also the situation when there were just like too many complaints against him coming from foreign merchants and like from other people engaged in foreign trade. So he wasn't really like meeting the expectations and requirements for this office. Because
let me ask a quick question there. Is this a moment in time when the cost of the job was excessively high? Like, did he have to pay more on this occasion than on other occasions?
so he first paid more, but then right before this trial, he paid the regular sum. So that was back to the sort of regular sum, and he received another sort of renewal of his royal privilege from Warsaw for this. So there was like a lot of cooperation among three of them, but then something happened and Bajdovic started suing him, and I don't know, maybe that was also like an indication of the sort of decreasing scale of the foreign trade at the time, when there was this sort of threat of the war with the Ottoman Empire, and there was not enough money for them to share, and they wanted to get rid of him. Maybe he just was like a very confrontational, sort of problematic personality. So there are like different possibilities, I guess, here. But the question of corruption and what counts as corruption at the time, it's very good, because from all these witness testimonies against him, I didn't really notice something like very much out of normal in those testimonies. So I don't know. That's a good point. I wish I had more to answer this. And then the first question is also very good, and I also have no definite answer, because it definitely reflects the direction of trade at different time periods, and Greeks would really trade more to the south, and I think the Venetian Greeks were more represented in Lviv at the time, and they would trade in Malvasia, the wine from the Eastern Mediterranean. That was their major sort of staple they trade. But the problem with them was that they were just a few of them. They were pretty influential economically, but they didn't have that much sort of infrastructure in the city, maybe to control different parts of the trade as Armenians did. They were not as much rooted in this part of the Commonwealth. Yeah, I wish I had more to answer, because these are very good observations.
Any other questions?
If there are no further questions, shall we proceed to devouring the food?
Yes.
Ask questions.
Yes.
It's a time-honored custom that we don't let the speaker eat because we're constantly asking the questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you.